The dim light of dawn crept through the curtains, spilling its soft gold across the bed where Daniel lay. His breathing was steady, the rhythm of a man who trusted the world he had built. Beside him, Helena stirred, but her eyes remained open. Sleep had not come easily in recent months. Not because of Daniel, he was as gentle and patient as ever. But patience did not pay debts. Gentleness did not fill the empty corners of a life she had once dreamed would be grander. She turned her head, watching him, feeling a strange sort of guilt bloom in her chest. He looked peaceful, his features softened in slumber. The same man who had held her hand through every storm, who had whispered promises against her skin when the world had felt too cruel. And yet, love alone had begun to feel like a cage. Daniel worked tirelessly, always coming home with tired eyes and a weary smile, assuring her that things would get better. But she knew better. The numbers never lied. The late notices tucked into the kitchen drawer told a story of a man who believed too much in hope and not enough in reality. Helena had never been the type to dream of castles, but she had imagined a life with more than just survival. A life where she could breathe without counting coins, where she could stretch her arms without feeling the weight of sacrifice. And then there was Adrian. Daniel's cousin was nothing like him. Where Daniel was kind, Adrian was confident. Where Daniel spoke of dreams, Adrian held them in his hands, molded them, shaped them into something tangible. His presence was a quiet thunder, commanding without ever needing to raise his voice. When he laughed, people listened. When he walked into a room, the air shifted. Helena had always noticed him in the way a person notices fire. Beautiful, dangerous, impossible to ignore. But she had never dared to step too close. Not until he made it easy. One evening, at a family gathering, Adrian had found her alone on the balcony, looking out over the darkened sky. The stars were distant, indifferent to the troubles of those below. Thinking too much? His voice had been smooth, carrying a hint of amusement. She had smiled without turning. Maybe. He had stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, even without touch. Some thoughts are meant to stay locked away, he murmured. Others are worth listening to. She had turned then, meeting his gaze. His eyes held no hesitation, no uncertainty. He was a man who knew what he wanted. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run, or if she wanted to stay and listen. That was where it had started. A simple conversation. A moment that stretched longer than it should have. A flicker of something that had no name yet. But the unraveling had begun. The days that followed wove a quiet tension into Helena's life, like the lingering scent of a storm before it breaks. She still woke beside Daniel, still felt the warmth of his arms when he pulled her close in sleep, still listened to the soft murmurs of love he spoke before leaving. Boo! Adrian was a presence now, slipping into her thoughts when she least expected it. A passing remark at a family gathering. A glance that held for just a moment too long. An unspoken understanding in the air between them, thick and heavy with things neither of them said. And then one evening he made his. It was at another gathering, this time at Adrian's home. A grand estate that sat on the edge of town, far from the cramped apartment where Helena and Daniel made do. Everything about the place spoke of wealth, not just in the way it gleamed with polished surfaces and expensive art, but in the ease with which Adrian carried himself within it. As if the world bent itself around his will. Helena had wandered, tracing her fingers along the edges of the fine woodwork, the velvet drapes, the marble counters cool beneath her touch. It was a different world. A world where struggle was a distant memory, where worry did not cling to every breath. Do you like it? She turned. Adrian stood in the doorway, watching her, his gaze unreadable. It's beautiful, she admitted. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, his movements slow, deliberate. It's nothing you couldn't have. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You say that like it's simple. He reached out then, fingers brushing against her wrist, barely there, yet electric. It is simple, he murmured. If you stop pretending it isn't. She should have pulled away. Should have laughed it off, turned on her heel, gone back to the gathering where Daniel was waiting for her. But she didn't. She stood there, pulse thrumming, her skin burning where he had touched it. And in that moment, the choice she had been trying to avoid no longer felt like a choice at all. The night Helena crossed the threshold of Adrian's world, she told herself it was just curiosity. Just a step. A taste. Nothing more. It started with a meeting, quiet, careful, hidden in the spaces where shadows stretched long and no one would ask questions. Adrian did not rush her. He never begged or pleaded. He simply made it easy. Come with me, he had said one evening, after another gathering where Daniel barely noticed her slipping away. She hesitated. And if I do? His smile was knowing, slow, confident. Then you'll finally understand what it feels like to live without waiting. It was the promise of something more. More than the weary sighs of a man who came home late, exhausted and hopeful. More than the endless cycle of one day things will be better. More than love without power. She went with him. What began as stolen hours soon became entire nights. Adrian knew how to make her forget. How to pull her into a world where money was a language spoken fluently, where luxury draped over her like a second skin. He touched her differently than Daniel did. Not with quiet devotion, but with certainty, as if she had always belonged to him. With each step deeper into Adrian's world, the space between her and Daniel widened. At first, Daniel did not question. Perhaps he did not want to. He still held her at night, still whispered her name against her skin, still told her he loved her in that quiet, unwavering way. But she could feel it, the way his grip had loosened. The way his eyes held the beginnings of a question he was too afraid to ask. And then one evening he did. She had come home late. Too late. The scent of Adrian's cologne still clung to her, faint but present. She set down her purse carefully, as if moving too fast would shatter the silence between them. Daniel was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together. He did not look angry, only tired. "Is there something you need to tell me?" His voice was quiet, measured. Helena felt her pulse quicken. She could lie. She could tell him what he wanted to hear, soothe the doubt in his eyes, weave another thread of deception into the life they had built. But the weight of her choices pressed too heavy on her chest. She swallowed. And she said nothing. That was the moment she lost him. Not in an explosion of rage, not in accusations or pleading, but in the quiet understanding that passed between them. Daniel nodded once. Just once. Then, without another word, he rose from the table and walked away. The next morning she packed her bags. And this time, she did not come back. The first few weeks in Adrian's world felt like stepping into a dream. Helena moved through lavish rooms draped in silk, her reflection caught in towering glass windows that overlooked a city she no longer had to struggle against. Gold brushed against her wrists, diamonds hung from her ears, and her footsteps echoed through spaces that belonged to her now. Adrian was generous. He wrapped her in luxury, in things Daniel could never give. Dinners at places where the wine was older than she was. Vacations where the ocean stretched endlessly beneath private balconies. It was everything she had once thought she wanted. But wealth had its own kind of silence. A hollow, sprawling thing that filled the spaces where love used to be. One evening, she sat alone in the grand living room, the fireplace flickering against the polished floor. Adrian was late. He was always late these days. Meetings, business, deals that did not concern her. She sipped from a glass of wine, her fingers tracing absent circles along its rim. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room. And then, like a whisper in the back of her mind, she thought of Daniel. The way he used to pull her close when he thought she was cold. The way he would press his lips to her temple, slow and reverent, as if he were praying to something only he could see. The way he had never needed money to make her feel rich. She exhaled sharply and set the glass down. It was foolish to think of him now. Foolish to wonder if he still lay on the left side of the bed, if he still left the porch light on even when no one was coming home. The door opened behind her, and Adrian walked in. She turned, expecting a greeting, a touch, something. But he barely glanced at her. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and sank into the chair across from her as if she were nothing more than another expensive fixture in the house. The realization came quietly, settling over her like a heavy weight. She had won. She had gotten everything she asked for. And yet, she had never been more alone.